Hello and welcome to Tech Takeaways, the podcast taking technology's largest challenges and chopping them down into lovely little bite-sized chunks so that you can enjoy. Tasty. I'm your co-host, Jason Fitzgerald, and I'm joined as ever by Wayne Miller.
Hi.
And Paul Stringfellow.
Hi. I'm now starving, by the way. Thanks.
Just you wait.
That's the best intro ever, Jace. Well done.
Thank you very much. So in this week's episode, we are talking about the changing nature of work and hybrid working as well. And we've seen some press around this recently and how that is changing. So do we want to set the scene a little bit?
Yeah, no, I think I come into the office on Monday, didn't I? And I was reading the Times on Sunday, and it was talking in the business section about enterprise organisations adopting a policy of bringing people back into the office. And we were talking when we were kicking it around about the impact of, the person that left the office in March 2020 versus the person that's coming back into the office in September 23. And, there's a different way that we work completely. So, is the office set up for that person walking back into the office? And that's when we thought this would be a good takeaway. And then on top of that, the conversations I've had this week since I've been back off my holiday, in case you didn't know I was away, we've been asking people, what's the policy of organisations? And we're seeing more and more now companies, it's not unadopting a hybrid approach, it's still a hybrid approach, but it's office predominantly over working remotely. So we were just trying to understand the challenges, and this is what we were kicking about in our conversation. So for me, when I left the office in March 2020, I wasn't a big Teams user. We are today. Was the infrastructure set up to have 20, 30, 40, hundreds of people all using Teams and the impact? So we were just kind of kicking that around. So
yeah, absolutely. I think video conferencing is one of those big things. It's massively changed. If I think back to prior to COVID, prior to lockdown, the number of video calls I was on per week was quite low. Maybe one or two per week, and now it's massive. It could be 4 per day. And I don't think that I'm unusual in that. I think that is probably the trend. Everyone has kind of ramped up with that. And I think that there's an expectation there as well that if we can do it in a video call, let's do it in a video call as opposed to meeting up.
It's funny you talk about that. I made my first phone call from a landline today. This year.
No way.
Yeah, I did.
What's a landline?
Yeah. And I even dialed 9 before I went out. And when I rung again, I said, do you realise this is the first landline call I've made this year? If you're watching, Dave, it was you. But yeah, how strange is that? I must have had hundreds of Teams calls, but one from a landline.
Did you have to put 10p in?
No,
it wasn't quite that. So I think it's really interesting, and if we park for now, this is not a conversation about the rights and wrongs of whether you should be forcing people back into the office or not. But I think a lot of the stuff is quite interesting. That idea of being on video calls. Funnily enough, I was reading something. I was surprised this was covered in the Beano, but it was. But they were talking.
Excellent source of news.
Indeed, yeah. One day I'll be a grown up and can read things like the Times.
Or the Viz.
It was definitely in Viz, but not for this episode. But they were talking in there actually about this idea of video calls. And the fact that they walked into a kind of an office space, open plan office space, and everybody was on video calls. And then that raised a question about what's the point? Why are they even in the office? Because they're not talking to each other. They're talking remotely to somebody. And all you've got, and we've seen this ourselves, haven't we, in our offices, is the impact of lots of people on video calls, because you're in a space that's not really designed for that.
Yeah. And
suddenly everybody, or you can hear, so we play the tactical mutes game, don't we, when we're doing video calls in our office, because we know if there's 2 or 3 of us on the same call, then those microphones will be picked. It doesn't matter how good the microphone is, the chance that the software itself is not quick enough to cancel out the noise in the background.
Yeah.
And so you're still going to get that. So actually, we were on a call today, weren't we, before we came out recording. And actually, rather than trying to do that, we just took ourselves off. Luckily, the space that we're in, we've got some separate meeting rooms. So we went off to a separate meeting room, and we both shouted at your laptop together. But it's those kind of things that are changing that we have to think about, because I think lots of lots of things that we were forced to do because we all had to, like for me, I had to live in my loft for 3 years. We had to do those things. But there's lots of good things that came from that. Actually, that thing you're talking about around meetings, that ability to have the flexibility and actually to people to be comfortable with the idea that, let's just jump on a Teams call or a Zoom call.
Yeah.
Whereas I think wind back 4 years, people didn't like the idea of jumping on a video call. Can't you come and see me in my office? That's hugely inefficient. We live in a world, and we've talked on the show before about things like sustainability, and it's a conversation we're having a lot. Well, why are we saying to people, you need to drive 2 hours to come and see me, and we'll have an hour, and then you drive back 2 hours, when actually what we could do is we can jump on a call in a minute, have our hour conversation, and then end that and go on and do something else, and we've never got in a car, And I think there's lots of those kind of things, but it is about balance, And obviously with this episode, we wanted to talk about what was some of the impact of that. So we've talked about the impact of lots of people on video calls and thinking about how do you practically do that.
Yeah.
But what's some of the other impacts then of bringing people in?
We're talking about infrastructure.
Yeah, exactly. I think that. And I think that expectations have changed. I think is probably the best way I could put that. So the expectation when working at home, if you think about, someone that's working at home, they may have a, standard broadband connection, so 50 meg, 60 meg, something like that, not ultra fast, but not slow. And that's to themselves, that's 50 meg connection all to themselves. It's fast, it's reliable.
It's available.
It's available to them for when they need to use it, and there might be 2 or 3 other people on that, but the bandwidth is quite high per user. If you look at that as we're now going to come back into the office and have that same expectation, well, they've got the expectation that it's going to be fast and reliable and the latency is going to be low. How do we guarantee that within the infrastructure for maybe 1,000 users? Is there enough broadband? Is the connection fast enough? Is the latency there? If we've got all of these calls going on simultaneously, let's say, 1,000 users, maybe 150, 200 simultaneous calls. Can the firewalls cope with that? Do we need to think about that?
Have we got the bandwidth?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think that extrapolated out. So if we look at kind of like large cities, city centres, during COVID, obviously everyone moved out of city centre and now they're on the way back in. That sudden demand in broadband usage, so increased bandwidth, can the ISPs cope? Well, some of them no, because there's just not the physical infrastructure in the ground to be able to do it. So I think customers are exploring different ways to do it. So we've mentioned this previously, SD-WAN. It's quite a cool technology, being able to bring multiple internet connections from maybe smaller providers into one firewall that gives you one kind of large link, and that could be 5G or fiber optic or standard telephone line. I think that's changing, and we're seeing some of that as well. But for me, I think it is around the expectation. How do we make sure that the infrastructure is architected in such a way to meet that expectation?
Well, if you look, most people are using wireless now as well, aren't they? So people are rocking up. They've got the laptop. They've got Teams on it.
Yeah.
They're connecting to the wireless. Is the wireless that they left? We've recently done a project where we've installed Wireless 6.
We did.
Into a local college. Is that network access point capable of having 20 or 30 people connected to it, running, 150, 200 kilobits per second throughput for Teams, as well as the wired infrastructure, as well as the firewall, as well as the ISP? All of that is going to need to be upgraded, isn't it, to kind of cope with the demand now?
In some cases, yeah. Yeah.
So if here's a strange chain of events now. It's that you two talking about the technology. So I'll ask the Wayne questions. So if we are,
oh dear, oh no, shaky ground here.
But if so somebody's listening to this and they're thinking, for whatever reason, actually, really, we want to be encouraging people back into the office because it suits our business model. So let's take that as read. So what are the kind of things that they need to be doing in terms of making sure they've got an environment for that to work effectively? Practical things they can be doing, perhaps. So what's some stuff they could do?
The ISP is the first one for me. Jason's made a good point there. A lot of companies historically would have a single ISP with 2 connections, active, passive. What I envisage seeing as we move forward will be, Jason was just mentioning SD-WAN, will be an organisation that will take 2 connections in an active scenario from different ISPs. So they've got their own resilience built in coming into, a form of SD-WAN, a firewall. And that presents one logical, I'm sounding like I'm technically comfortable here, but that presents one logical connection back into the organisation. And from some of the SD-WAN conversations we've had so far, the SD-WAN device will make decisions on which circuit to use based upon availability, latency, jitter, all of them things that I know nothing about, but I know the words. And then infrastructure, you know more than I do, about the physical infrastructure, the cable, the switches, the access points. I've always wanted to try and have a rule of thumb that says this AP can cope with this many concurrent connections with this much throughput, but I've never been really able to understand the tech data sheets.
Well, and do those numbers need to be reconsidered now? Because maybe some of the things we thought about, so X amount of users on an access point, but we weren't thinking at the time of X amount of users doing video calls, hitting SaaS applications.
We were browsing websites, weren't we, on portals that weren't time dependent when, milliseconds weren't important. They are now. I think, does video fall if it's less than, if it goes over 30 or 40 milliseconds? I don't know. There was a rule. I can't remember what it is.
So another question, maybe one for you, Jace, this actually, in terms of, so while we're talking here about people encouraging people back to the office, there's probably relatively few cases where it's everybody. But there will certainly be encouraging more and more, maybe a bigger percentage to come back, but there will still be people who, because, we talked before about this huge benefit from things that we learned during COVID. So actually we talked about better sustainability by using Teams and Zoom rather than getting in the car for a 1-hour meeting. But does the idea that we're going to have this kind of hybrid workforce, does that dictate some of the architectural changes that people need to consider as well?
Yeah, I think it probably does, because if you were to look at, I'm going to stay with bandwidth and infrastructure with this, it's easy to look at kind of a typical usage and times that by staff counts. But if you're not going to have all of your staff in, you maybe have, 4 days in the office, 1 day a week at home. Well, that's 80% total count, isn't it? So 80%, okay, well, what does 80% mean? How do we work out if the infrastructure is sized appropriately or not? There's a couple of tools that we can use for that. One of which is Microsoft Teams dashboard. So we can go into the dashboard and we can take a look at how many calls are happening, the frequency of the calls.
What, as an administrator? Sorry, I didn't know.
Yeah. So in Microsoft 365 dashboard, you can go in, you get all kinds of stats on bandwidth, upload speed, download speed, the connection specific details, and really it gives you an indication on there as to what a good quality call looks like and a number that are happening within your organisation across the entire
concurrently
staff
as well.
count.
It'll give you kind of your busy period.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah. So if you can understand the total number of calls that are happening and the bandwidth with that, then you can start to make some calculations to say, do we need more access points or do we need some faster access points? Interesting that you mentioned Wi-Fi 6 earlier. So Wi-Fi 6 points will actually do faster than a gig wirelessly. So most companies have a wired LAN infrastructure to access points that's probably running at a gig. So what that means is that the access point is able to do faster than a gig. But if the cabling itself is going back to a switch that's doing 1 gig, there's your bottleneck. Yeah. So the advice for Wi-Fi 6 is actually to use 2.5 gig uplinks from the switch to the access points. Okay, fantastic. Well, you can upgrade the access switch, but then how do we link it back to the core? Do we need to then consider fiber optics in the core? It's almost like an end-to-end consideration to say, let's remove all the bottlenecks so that we're given a great experience, because that's what, if the driver for this is to encourage people to back into the office, you've got to give a great experience. It's got to work. It's got to work at least as good as what they get at home. Because if the flip side is option A, I can work at home, I can walk the dog, I can wash the dishes, whatever you need to do.
Have you got it? Didn't know you had a dog.
I don't have a dog. I borrow yours. Versus I go into an office and I get bad Wi-Fi and I can't really do much. Well, you kind of shooting yourself in the foot that way. So I think look at it.
It's important people realise Wayne's got dog resilience, hasn't he? He's got 2 dogs.
Yeah, HA
so,
dog.
Yeah, so if we lose one dog, we're still good.
Yeah.
So look, I mean, I appreciate we're going to run out of time here, but in terms of organisations who want to bring lots of people back to the office, is there any scenario where they can do this without thinking and just demand everybody back, or do they have to do a piece of work first that says, what is that going to look like?
Yeah, you've got to look for, and if you look at the way they're bringing people back into the office, they're normally saying people will come back to the office in groups so everyone can collaborate. It's pointless coming back in, when you want to come back, because you want to be with your, or they want people to be with the colleagues to encourage collaboration. But you've probably got to look at the busiest moments and plan for that, haven't you? You've got to look at how many people are in, what percentage. I mean, I didn't know that was available. If you look at Teams dashboard, what's the busiest moment that we've got, and we've got a plan for that and headroom. So, can the APs support the number of people connecting to them? If not, talk to us. Is the bandwidth available from the ISP capable of supporting that number of concurrent Teams calls, or even, as everyone moves to SIP or hosted voice with the switch off of the ISDN network? So we've got ISP. And is it ISP resilient? So you've got 2 instead of 1 with an active passive. Have you got firewall throughput? You mentioned that before. Yeah. We've done a couple of quotes recently where people have got faster bandwidth requirements, which means they need chunkier boxes that can inspect more packets. Is that what a firewall does?
Pretty much, yeah.
I sound like I should be in pre-sales, don't I? Right the way through to the wired infrastructure, to the access points that people connect to, because I'd imagine most people aren't plugging into a LAN, are they, on a wireless, on a laptop?
Yeah, probably not.
Yeah.
I think a lot of laptops don't even have Ethernet adapters on them anymore. Yeah.
So,
well, I think that's a great episode. I've really enjoyed that. That's good. So I hope you've enjoyed it too. Subscribe. Hit subscribe below if you're watching it on YouTube. We're available in all good homes of podcasts if you're a listener. So thanks for listening.